The Ravenscroft soirée had been arranged by the Dowager Countess to mean something specific, and every person in that candlelit drawing room understood it. The musicians played behind the terrace doors. The footmen moved with the quiet efficiency of a household performing at its highest pitch. Miss Caroline Vane stood near the marble fireplace in white trimmed with silver, her pearl earrings catching the light at each small turn of her head, and she smiled at Edmund Ashmore, Earl of Ravenscroft, with the particular composure of a woman who has been told all her life that she is the correct choice. Cecily Fairwood stood at the far end of the room near the window, holding a glass she had not tasted. She was there as a consequence of employment. Lady Maud Ashmore, the Earl's elderly aunt and a woman of warm eccentricities, had required a reader companion for the season, and Cecily had needed the position. That was all the story the household knew, and Cecily had no intention of offering them another. She wore sage green because she owned it. She wore her hair as she always did, and she stood where she was expected to stand, and she watched Miss Vane laugh at something the Earl had not quite said, and she kept her left hand closed around the small warmth of the ring in her palm. She did not look at him if she could help it. She managed it tolerably that evening, which was not the same as managing it well. The Dowager crossed the room toward her with the smooth authority of a woman accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves in her wake. Lady Helena Ashmore was 58 years of silver hair and composed purpose, and she stopped beside Cecily just long enough to say, in a voice pitched for Cecily alone, that Miss Fairwood would find it agreeable to remain near Lady Maud this evening, as the Earl was engaged in matters that required his full attention. The words were polite. The instruction inside them was not. To the Dowager, Cecily was the solicitor's daughter. She had always been the solicitor's daughter. She suspected she always would be. She pressed her thumb against the garnet and said nothing. 3 years earlier, in the garden of her father's house in Wiltshire, on an evening in late September, when the light was the color of old honey, Edmund Ashmore had placed a narrow gold ring on her finger and said that he meant it to be permanent. He had said it simply, without rhetorical flourish, the way he said most things that mattered to him. She had not taken the ring off for 7 months. Then his mother's letter arrived. The letter explained, in the Dowager's polished and impeccable sentences, that Lord Ravenscroft had reconsidered, that the match was unsuitable, that Cecily ought not to write, as the Earl had asked that correspondence on this matter be directed to her ladyship. Directly it was signed with a formal cordiality that left no crack for appeal. Cecily had written once to Edmund. The letter was not answered. She removed the ring on the 8th day. After that, she placed it in the small cedar box her father had given her, and she did not wear it again. She kept it, though she could not have explained why. Perhaps because releasing the ring felt like releasing him, and there was a part of her that had not yet found a way to do that. 6 months after the Dowager's letter, the Earl of Ravenscroft married Lady Dorothea Vance at Sinquargny, George's, Hanover Square, in a ceremony the whole of London society attended or claimed to have attended. The wedding breakfast lasted 4 hours. The toasts were recorded in the papers. The Countess of Ravenscroft was described in 3 different columns as a great beauty, which she was. Cecily read one of the accounts and did not read the others. Lady Dorothea Ashmore died 18 months later, of a fever. Following the birth of her son, the boy was named Thomas. He was 2 years old now, and Cecily had learned this from Lady Maud in the first week of her employment, in a tone that managed to contain both grief and the particular tenderness old women reserve for small boys who have lost their mothers. She had not anticipated that the position would bring her here, to this house, to this room. She had not anticipated many things. The position had come through Lady Maud's enquiry to a registry office in Mayfair, the sort of registry that handled the situations of educated women who had found themselves on the wrong side of circumstance. Cecily had been attending this particular registry for 8 months. She had 2 previous positions listed, a 6-month engagement as a governess to a family in Shropshire, where she had taught 2 small girls their French verbs and their watercolor, and had been let go when the family removed to Scotland, and a 3-month engagement as a secretary to an authoress in Bath, which had ended when the authoress decided the book she was writing was not worth finishing. She had come to the registry in the autumn with a character reference from the Bath authoress, and the quiet, efficient manner of a woman who has learned that capability is a commodity and that its market price is fixed by things other than its quality. Lady Maud had not asked her many questions at the interview. She had looked at Cecily for a long time, with the bright, particular attention of a woman who has outlived most of her contemporaries, and finds this has done something clarifying to her perception. And then she had asked if Cecily read aloud with good pace, and if she had views of her own on what she read. And Cecily had said yes to both. And Lady Maud had said good. The last girl had read everything with the same pleasant neutrality one might use for reciting an inventory, and that she found it restful to know that someone in the room still had opinions. She had been hired on a Thursday and arrived at Ravenscroft House on the following Monday, which was not sufficient time to prepare herself, but then she had not had sufficient time for several years, and had learned to proceed anyway. Ravenscroft House was not what she had pictured. She had pictured a house of grandiose cold, the kind of establishment that crushes its residents with its own importance, and found instead a house that was large and well-ordered and faintly worn in the ways that suggested genuine habitation rather than performance. The library had 3 cracked spines on the 3rd shelf. The morning room's curtains were faded unevenly by a window that faced the wrong direction. Someone had left a child's wooden horse on the window seat of the upper corridor, and no one had moved it. And this made Cecily feel unexpectedly that the house might be lived in rather than merely maintained. If you find yourself wondering, as she stood there in the candlelight, whether she had made a grave mistake in accepting Lady Maud's offer, know that the question had occurred to her too, in the small hours of her first night at Ravenscroft House. She had decided that the alternative, which was to refuse employment from any household that might carry a shadow of her own history, was a luxury she could not afford. Her father had been dead 4 years. She had a cedar box and a small amount of savings and a capability for quiet hard work that the market for such things valued precisely as much as it valued her origins. She had taken the position. She had resolved to be invisible. She was managing it, more or less, except for the evenings when he was in the same room. He was not what she had been afraid he would be. She had been afraid in the abstract of coldness, of a man who had chosen to withdraw and did not wish to be reminded of what he had withdrawn from. What she encountered instead was a man who seemed not to know how to look at her. He did not avoid her precisely. He was careful, controlled, correct in every form of address. His attention moved toward her at odd moments, all the same like a compass needle that had not yet settled, and she could not determine what it meant, and that was in some ways worse than coldness. The night of the soirée she went to bed early and lay awake listening to the house settle. The morning after the soirée, the Earl appeared in Lady Maud's sitting room while Cecily was reading aloud. He had come to inquire after his aunt's health, which was declining in the gradual and dignified manner of someone who had decided to do it on her own terms. Lady Maud informed him that she was perfectly well, and that Miss Fairwood was reading to her from a volume of natural history, which she found far more interesting than the novels the last companion had offered. Edmund stood at the door for a moment, his gaze moving to Cecily's page, and he said something brief and appropriate about the importance of a good reader. His eyes did not quite reach hers. She looked back at her page. He was called away before she had finished the chapter, but she knew with a precision that her rational mind found entirely inconvenient, exactly where he stood in the corridor for the 3 seconds before he walked away. The house had a rhythm to it that she learned quickly. Lady Maud took her meals early and her rest in the afternoon, and her reading in the morning and the evening, and the evenings that were not taken up with society obligations were spent in the library, which was where Cecily spent the small portion of her own time that was not required for employment. She went in the hour before dinner, when it was generally unoccupied. She went in that hour on the 4th day, and found the Earl standing at the window with his back to the door, and she paused on the threshold, and he said, without turning, that she was welcome to the shelves. He would be gone presently. He did not leave presently. He remained at the window for another quarter of an hour while she moved along the shelves, and she did not speak because she could not find a sentence that was not either dishonest or catastrophic, and he did not speak for reasons she could only guess at, and the fire in the grate was the loudest thing in the room. Then he said, still without turning from the window, that he hoped the position was agreeable to her, that he hoped his aunt was not a difficult employer. She said that Lady Maud was exceptionally good company. He said that he was glad to hear it. His voice was low and careful, and it meant a great deal more than it said. She found a volume she was not looking for and left the library. At the same unhurried pace she had entered it, and she did not run, until she was safely in the corridor. She had not told Lady Maud about the ring. She had not told anyone. There was no version of the telling that did not either require her to appear pathetic or place the dowager in a position of open accusation, and she had no evidence for the second and no appetite for the first. The ring stayed in the cedar box in her room. She thought about it less than she had expected to, or she told herself so. The second time she came to the library in the evening hour, he was not there, and the fire was laid but unlit, and she read by candlelight for 40 minutes before she heard his step in the corridor and the brief pause outside the door that might have been nothing and might have been something, and then silence, and then his step continuing past. She read another 3 pages of the volume in her hands without retaining a word. The third time he came in while she was already seated. He went to his usual place at the window first, which was not a chair but a standing position, with his arms loose at his sides and his gaze on the garden below, and she read and did not look up, and after a while he moved to the chairs near the fire and sat down with a book of his own, and they read in the same silence they had been, improbably, one inhabiting for 10 days. The fire was warm, the house was quiet, in the way of a house at night, all its smaller sounds absorbed into one ambient silence. She was aware of the exact distance between them with the same certainty she had always been aware of him across rooms, that involuntary accounting the body performs without consent, and she thought that this was what she had feared when she accepted the position, and that it was worse and better than she had expected, and that she did not know what to do with either fact. He closed his book. First, he said without preamble that he owed her an apology. She went very still. He said that he had behaved, at her arrival, in a manner that was less than courteous, and that he was aware of it, and that the fault was his, and that he wished to correct it if she would allow it. His voice was even, as always. His eyes were on the fire. She said that she had not noticed any discourtesy. He said that was kind of her. She said she meant it. He looked at her then. Not the careful, managed glance across the dinner table, not the gaze that arrived and departed in the same second. He looked at her directly, the way he had in the garden 3 years ago, as though he had made a decision about looking and was prepared to stand behind it, and the fire was between them, and the room was warm, and she thought, with the body's plain, uncensored assessment, that she was in a great deal of difficulty. She said good night, and she went to bed, and she lay awake for 2 hours listening to the frost settle on the windows. It was the 3rd week of her employment when she saw him in the corridor at 2:30 in the morning. She had come down for water because the housemaid had forgotten to leave any in her room, and the back stairs were dark, and she had a candle. She heard the boy before she saw either of them. Thomas Ashmore was 2 years old, and had a habit of waking at odd hours that the nurse had reported to Lady Maud with quiet exasperation. And Cecily had heard this in passing, and not particularly retained it, until she turned the corner of the upper corridor and found the small boy sitting on the floor outside his nursery door in his nightgown, crying in the specific way of a child who has been alone too long. She sat down on the floor beside him. She did not think about it. The floor was cold through her nightgown, and the candle made a small yellow island of light around them, and she put her hand on the boy's back and began to tell him a story about a field mouse who lived in a library and had read every book on the lowest shelf. She chose the story because she had told it to her young cousins and because it was quiet and strange and had no frightening parts. Thomas Ashmore stopped crying after approximately 4 sentences. She did not know Edmund was in the corridor until Thomas looked up past her shoulder and said, "Papa." in a voice made rough by tears, and she turned and found the Earl standing 10 feet away in the dark outside the circle of her candle. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before and could not name. It was not the careful, controlled face he wore in the drawing room. It was something underneath that face, unguarded, and it was the most dangerous thing she had encountered since arriving at Ravenscroft House. She stood up. She picked up Thomas and handed him to his father, because that was the correct and appropriate thing to do. And she said that he had simply been lonely. That was all. And she said good night. And she walked back to her room with measured, careful steps. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time in the dark. If there is a moment in a story like this one where everything that follows becomes inevitable, that corridor was it. She did not know that yet. She sat in the dark and told herself she had done nothing untoward because she had not, and that he had looked at her strangely because he had, and that it meant nothing in particular because she needed it to mean nothing in particular, and she was not entirely successful. The dinner party at Ravenscroft House the following week was the Dowager's arrangement, and Miss Caroline Vane was placed at the Earl's right hand. Cecily attended in her role as Lady Maud's companion. The Dowager, in a voice that carried precisely as far as the Dowager intended, remarked to the woman on her left that it was, of course, kind of Maud to have taken in a reader. The solicitor's daughter had come highly recommended. Poor thing, one did what one could for the daughters of professional men when they found themselves in reduced circumstances. The woman on the Dowager's left said yes, quite, and looked across the table at Cecily with the mild and not unkind curiosity of a person examining something that did not quite belong in its setting. Cecily ate her soup. She ate it slowly, and with care, because the alternative was to look up, and looking up meant looking either at Miss Vane, who was managing to be simultaneously lovely and conscious of being observed, or at the Earl, who was managing to be simultaneously polite to Miss Vane and, she suspected, not entirely present in the conversation, or at the Dowager, whose gaze had returned to Cecily once already, with an expression that contained nothing Cecily could object to and everything she needed to know about what the Dowager intended. She ate her soup and listened to the conversation around her, which moved across the usual territories of the season, the latest arrivals to London, the question of whether Lord and Lady Whitmore intended to open their house this year, and the subject of the new park. They were extending on the south side of the square, and she said nothing, and was expected to say nothing. And this was the correct arrangement, and she was entirely comfortable with it, and was not counting the minutes until she could return to Lady Maud's sitting room. Edmund's gaze moved once, sharply, to his mother's face, and then away. He did not speak for the next few minutes. She knew this without watching him. The particular quality of his silence was identifiable at the distance of a dinner table, which was information she did not need and had apparently acquired regardless. That was the second voicing. Cecily had heard the first. She did not yet know about the third. The midpoint of the season brought a change in Lady Maud's health. Not dramatic, but perceptible. She tired earlier and required her rest in the morning as well as the afternoon, and the reading hours contracted, and Cecily had more solitary time than she was accustomed to. She spent some of it in the library, which was now understood between her and the Earl to be a shared space, governed by the tacit agreement that they would speak carefully about things of no particular consequence. It was, she thought, a peculiar arrangement. She did not know another name for it. One afternoon, he came in from riding and stood at the fire, and she watched, without meaning to, the way the heat moved across his face, and she saw the small exhaustion beneath the controlled expression, and she said, before she had decided to, that she thought he slept poorly. He looked at her. He said that it was not a recent development. She said she was sorry to hear it. He said, after a moment, that it had begun 3 years ago, more or less. That a certain loss, not of life but of expectation, had changed the quality of his nights, and that he had never entirely recovered the old pattern. His voice was level, and he was looking at the fire, and she understood that he was telling her something he did not tell people, And she understood also that she could not respond to it honestly without destroying a fiction they were both, for different reasons, maintaining. She said that she was sorry. He said he supposed time would manage it. The afternoon light was pale and thin through the library windows, and the fire was the warmest thing in the room, and she had her hands in her lap, and she thought, with a clarity she had not allowed herself before, that the man sitting across from her had been injured, and she did not fully understand by what or by whom, and that it mattered to her, and that it should not. She had spent 3 years constructing a particular understanding of him. The understanding was economical and served her well. He had made a choice, and the choice had not been her, and there was nothing in that which required further excavation. Men of his position were required to make choices. The machinery that pressed on him was as real as the machinery that pressed on her, only it operated from the other direction, and its instruments were different, and perhaps she had always known, if she was honest with herself, that the garden in Wiltshire had been a moment outside the machinery rather than inside it, and that the machinery had eventually reclaimed him. She had made peace with this understanding. She had packed the ring in a cedar box and gone to Shropshire, and taught French verbs and watercolor, and made a sufficient life. And it had been sufficient. It had been exactly that, and she had not spent very many evenings sitting in the dark thinking about a garden in late September and the quality of the light. She had been lying to herself, slightly and consistently, for 3 years. The man sitting across from her in the library in the late afternoon, with the fire going low, and a grief in his face he was not quite managing to conceal, was not a man who had made a comfortable choice. He was a man who had lost something and did not know what to do with the losing. Footin. She recognized this in the most inconvenient way possible, which was through the body, through the particular ache of recognizing in another person a wound that rhymes with your own. She said nothing further. She opened her book again and read, or appeared to read, and after a while he rose and said that he would not keep her, and she said he had not been keeping her, and he left. And the fire settled behind him, and she sat in the library until it was dark and past the dinner hour, thinking thoughts she did not intend to keep. She found the letter the following Tuesday. Lady Maud had asked her to organize a box of correspondence that had been sitting in the small writing room since the previous winter. It was sorting work, nothing more. Letters to be filed or discarded, receipts for household accounts, the ordinary accumulation of an elderly woman's careful life. Cecily was deep into the 3rd stack when she found an envelope addressed in a hand she recognized. She knew the hand because she had memorized it once, years ago, reading it for the 7th time in a garden in Wiltshire. The seal had been broken and repressed, and she could see the edge where the wax had been disturbed and replaced. She sat for a long time looking at the address, which was her father's house in Wiltshire, and then she opened it. The letter inside was in his hand. It was dated 6 weeks after the evening in the garden with the ring. It said, in the careful and formal sentences he used when something mattered greatly to him, that he wished to confirm the private understanding they had made, that he was writing with the full knowledge and against the wishes of his mother, who had told him the matter was unsuitable, and that he did not agree with his mother, and that he was inquiring as to whether Cecily remained of the same mind as she had been in September, and that he would wait on her answer. The letter had been sent to her father's house. The letter had arrived at her father's house, because it was addressed to her father's house, and it had found its way into a box of Lady Maud's correspondence. She sat for a very long time in the writing room with the letter in her hands and the fire going cold behind her. And she arrived, slowly, at an understanding of exactly what had happened 3 years ago. Edmund had not withdrawn. He had written. The letter had been intercepted, rerouted, and suppressed, and she had been told he had withdrawn, and he had been told she had not answered, and each of them had believed a thing the other had not done. And 18 months later, he had married Dorothea Vance in good faith, in grief, in the reasonable conclusion that the woman who held his ring had chosen to release him. She did not weep. She sat in the writing room until the light changed, and then she put the letter in her apron pocket, and she went to find Lady Maud. She did not find Lady Maud. she found the Dowager. Lady Helena Ashmore had come to call on her sister-in-law, and had taken the writing room as her temporary domain, as she took most spaces, and when Cecily came through the door, the Dowager's expression underwent a small, precise rearrangement that told Cecily everything she needed to know about what the Dowager suspected she was carrying. The Dowager said in her most composed and gracious voice that she was sorry to inform Cecily that Lady Maud's health would require her to dissolve the companion arrangement, that the doctors had recommended rest and limited society. That Cecily would, of course, be given a month's additional salary as a courtesy, and she would be very happy to write a character reference, and she hoped Cecily appreciated that this was entirely a matter of Maud's health and comfort. Cecily looked at her. The Dowager's expression was composed and final, the expression of a woman presenting a closed door. There was nothing behind it that admitted the possibility of a different conversation. There was no acknowledgement of the letter in Cecily's pocket, because the Dowager had not survived 30 years of managing this family by acknowledging the things she preferred not to have noticed. Cecily thought about taking the letter from her pocket and placing it on the table between them. She thought about this for approximately 4 seconds, and then she thought about what it would cost her to make that gesture, and what it would change, and what it would not change, and she made her decision. She said that she understood. She said that she would make her arrangements. She said good night. She walked out of the writing room and up the back stairs and into her small room where the cold air had settled in the corners in the way of rooms that are not occupied by fires, and she sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. Then she opened the cedar box and looked at the garnet ring for a long time. She had not looked at it plainly in months. She had been carrying it and being aware of it and pressing her thumb against it through fabric, but she had not opened the box and looked at the ring in the lamplight and let it be what it was. She put the letter beside it. They made a small collection of evidence, the ring and the letter, and they were worth a great deal and could be taken nowhere. Then she put the cedar box in her small trunk, and she began with the quiet, methodical efficiency of a woman who has packed up her life before to make her arrangements. She did not know, as she did this, that Mr. Brikes, Phineas Greer, her father's former solicitor and the keeper of his papers, had spent 6 weeks in the preceding months tracing a chain of correspondence that a clerk in the late Mr. Fairwood's estate had found misfiled among 3 years of unopened household receipts. She did not know that Mr. Greer had written to the Earl of Ravenscroft 4 days ago with a summary of his findings, having established that the letter in question had been redirected, not from her father's house, but before reaching it, through an agent engaged for the purpose, and then placed, presumably by way of precaution, in a file of Lady Maud's domestic correspondence that the Dowager had organized. She did not know that the Earl had received Mr. Greer's letter the previous afternoon and had sat in his study for 3 hours reading it, and then had summoned his own solicitor. She knew none of this. She knew that she was leaving, and that it would be, by some obscure mercy, the last time she had to leave him. The Ravenscroft winter soiree was set for the following Friday, and it was a larger occasion than the first, because the Dowager had arranged it to serve a purpose, and the Dowager's arrangements were always attended. Miss Caroline Vane arrived in white and silver and stood near the fireplace as she had at the first soiree, and the musicians played, and the room filled with the sound of 200 people performing the season. The Dowager stood near the entrance, receiving with the pleasant authority of a woman who had made this particular room mean something for 30 years. She had not been informed that Cecily was in the house. Lady Maud, who was a woman of warm eccentricities, had not cancelled her own attendance at the soiree, simply because her companion's position had been abruptly dissolved. She had instead invited Cecily to accompany her as she had always done, in the sitting room of Ravenscroft House, an hour before the party began, with a tone that admitted no argument, and a hand on Cecily's arm that was as close as Lady Maud came to an embrace. Cecily stood near the window again, the same window, holding a glass she had not tasted, because some things cannot be altered by 3 weeks of determined effort. The ring was in her left hand, and she had not consciously put it there. She heard the Dowager's voice first. The Dowager was speaking to Lady Claremont, who was standing 3 feet from Cecily, and whose expression suggested she was not entirely attending, and the dowager was saying, in the carrying tone of someone who had not realized or had not bothered to realize that the subject of their observation was within earshot, that it was curious what certain girls convinced themselves of, that solicitors' daughters had a particular tendency toward romantic misapprehension, that she was certain Miss Fairwood had been perfectly sincere in her misunderstanding of the nature of her arrangement with Ravenscroft House, but that one simply could not allow that sort of confusion to persist unaddressed. Lady Claremont made a sound of sympathetic agreement. This was the third voicing. Cecily stood very still, and the ring was warm in her closed hand, and she thought, with a calm that surprised her, that she had been reduced to a misapprehension. That all of it, the garden in September, the 7 months, the cedar box, the 3 years had been organized by this woman into the minor category of a servant girl's romantic confusion. She was still thinking this when he came through the drawing-room door. He had been somewhere else in the house. He came in from a side entrance rather than the formal receiving hall, which suggested he had been looking for something or someone and had found them in the wrong direction. And his face when he came through that door was not the controlled face of the soiree. It was the face from the corridor, the face she had seen over his son's head in the dark, and it was looking at her with the directness of a man who has run out of reasons to look elsewhere. He crossed the room. The dowager saw him moving, and her expression underwent the small, precise rearrangement of a woman calculating a new arrangement of forces. Miss Vane turned from the fireplace. The room did not stop. Exactly, but it slowed, because a man crossing a room with that kind of certainty has a way of pulling the attention of everyone in his path. He stopped in front of Cecily. He was close enough that she could see the thin scar along his left cheekbone and the exactness of his expression and the effort it had taken him to say nothing for 3 weeks. He did not say anything for a moment. The room was paying attention. The dowager had gone very still in the way of a woman who recognizes that the scene is no longer hers to arrange. He held out his hand. She knew what he was asking. She knew it in the same way she had always known things about him, through the body before the mind permitted it. She opened her left hand. The garnet ring lay there in her palm, warm from 3 weeks of being held. He took it. He turned to the room. His voice was level and carrying, and left no space for amendment. She held my ring 3 years ago. She holds it still. Miss Vane looked at the fireplace. Lady Claremont looked at the floor. The dowager's fan held at chest height, lowered by exactly 2 inches. And her expression did not fragment because she was too disciplined for that. But something behind it failed, quietly, in the way of a woman whose script has always worked until now. Edmund turned back to Cecily, and the room and all the machinery it contained was the least interesting thing in it. He said in a voice that was not for the room that he owed her an account of what had been done in his name without his knowledge, and that he intended to give it, and that he would not, if she was willing, give it at a soiree. She looked at him for a moment. She said that she thought that was probably sensible. Mr. Greer arrived the following morning with a document he had prepared at the Earl's request, attesting to the existence and contents of the intercepted letter and the nature of its redirection. The dowager was shown it, in the Earl's study with the Earl present and the solicitor present, and Lady Maud present, which was Lady Maud's own insistence and admitted no argument. The dowager looked at the document for a long time without speaking. Then she said that she had done what she believed necessary. Then she said nothing further for the remainder of the interview, and she left with a composure that was real, because it was the only thing she still had, and it was the composure of a woman who has been corrected, precisely and permanently, in front of the people whose opinion she valued most. She was not ruined. She was not punished. She was displaced, quietly and completely, from the story she had written for her son, and she understood it, and that was enough. Edmund found Cecily in the library that afternoon. She was not reading. She was sitting in the chair near the window, with her hands in her lap and the cedar box open on the table beside her. And he came and sat in the chair across from her the way he had done for 3 weeks of careful pretending, and he said that he needed to tell her everything, and she said that she suspected she needed to hear it. He told her about the letter he had written. He told her about the months of silence that had followed, and what he had concluded from that silence, and how he had married Dorothea in the honest belief that the woman who held his ring had chosen to release him, and that Dorothea had been a person of warmth and quality, who had deserved better than a man still carrying a grief he had no name for, and that he had done his best by her, and that her death had been a loss for more than him. Cecily told him about the dowager's letter. She told him about the 7 months of carrying the ring and the 8 days, and then the cedar box. She told him about reading the account of his wedding in the newspaper, and which account it was, and that she had not read the others. And she told him this last part, in a voice that was steady, because she had learned to keep things steady. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she had finished, he was quiet for a long time, looking at the fire, and then he said that he was sorry. He said it plainly, without qualification, in the way he said the things that mattered. She said she was sorry too. He reached into his coat pocket and set the garnet ring on the table between them. He said that the question he had asked in September 3 years ago had not been answered, so far as he was concerned, and that he would like to ask it again if she was willing to hear it, and that he would not this time route the answer through anyone's mother. She looked at the ring on the table for a moment. She picked it up. She said that she thought she would like to hear it. The winter settled in the following week, the way English winters do, with a quiet gray sky and frost on the garden walks and a stillness that made the house feel sealed and warm and sufficient to itself. Lady Maud was feeling better, she said so with the brisk satisfaction of someone who had suspected she would, and was pleased to be correct. Thomas had discovered that the library contained books with illustrations of animals, and had developed a habit of appearing at the door with a small authoritative knock and a request for the one with the bears, which turned out to be a volume of natural history on the second shelf, and which he called the Bear's Book, and which was always, by the time he knocked, already in Cecily's hands. She did not know, when she had told the story about the field mouse in the library that night in the corridor, that the boy would remember it. He told it back to her 2 weeks later, slightly wrong in the details, but correct in the spirit, which was more than could be said for many accounts of things. Edmund found her in the library that evening, as he had a habit of finding her there. The fire was good, and Thomas was asleep upstairs, and Lady Maud had retired with her own book, which she was perfectly capable of reading herself, and had simply preferred not to for the last several weeks. The candles were burning low. Outside the window, the frost had begun, and the garden was white and still. He sat in the chair across from her, which was his chair now, as this was their library now, and she was reading, and he was not quite reading, which was also a habit, and, after a time, he reached across and put his hand over hers on the open page, and she looked up. His face was the face from the corridor, the real one, underneath. She turned her hand over and held his, and the fire settled in the grate with a small domestic sound, and outside the library window the frost lay across the garden of Ravenscroft House, and the night was very quiet. And the ring she was wearing caught the candlelight the way a small piece of the world finally restored to its right position will sometimes catch the light. She had not taken it off again. She did not intend to. Thank you for staying until the end of this one. If Cecily's story moved you, leave a word in the comments and come back for the next.